The carriage came to a sudden stop outside Ashworth Hall, and the entire courtyard fell silent. Every servant standing near the entrance turned to look, their faces tight with worry. Inside the grand house, Duke Edmund Ashworth stood by the window with his jaw locked tight, watching the carriage door with a look that could freeze fire. He had been dreading this moment for weeks. Today he was getting married to a woman he had never met, and he had already decided in his mind that he would refuse her the moment she stepped out. Word had spread through the town days earlier. People whispered that the bride was nothing but a merchant's daughter, a woman without noble blood, without polish, without anything that belonged in a house like this one. Some said her family had bought their way into this marriage using money, not merit. Others claimed she was plain, awkward, and completely unfit to stand beside a duke. Edmund had heard every version of these stories, and though he tried to appear unaffected, something inside him had already built a wall. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, stood beside him, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She had arranged this marriage out of necessity, not desire. The Ashworth estate was drowning in debt, and only one family in the region had the wealth to save it, the Hastings family. Their fortune came from trade, not titles, but their gold spent just as well as any nobleman's inheritance. Edmund had agreed to the marriage only because his family's future depended on it, but agreeing to save the estate did not mean he had to accept the woman with open arms. "She is only here for the ceremony," Edmund said quietly, more to himself than to his mother. "Once the papers are signed, I owe her nothing more than a title and a roof." His mother did not answer. She simply watched him with tired eyes, the same eyes that had seen too many disappointments already. Outside, the carriage door opened, and a young woman stepped down onto the gravel path. She wore a simple gown, elegant but without the excessive decoration many noblewomen preferred. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and her posture was straight, calm, unshaken by the crowd of curious eyes watching her. This was Eleanor Hastings, the bride everyone had already judged before she ever spoke a single word. Whispers rippled through the small gathering of guests near the entrance. "She looks so ordinary," one woman murmured to another. "I expected something more dramatic, given all the talk." "The Duke will not even glance twice at her," another guest replied under his breath. "Mark my words, say, this marriage will be over before it even begins." Eleanor heard fragments of these comments as she walked toward the entrance, but she did not let her expression falter. She had grown up hearing judgment her entire life, whispers about her family's wealth being new instead of inherited, comments about her manners being too direct for a woman of her supposed status. She had learned long ago that reacting only fed the gossip further. Instead, she walked with her chin lifted, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of their stares. Her father, Charles Hastings, walked a few steps behind her, his expression proud despite the murmurs surrounding them. He had built his fortune from nothing, working his way up through years of hard trade deals and careful investments. He believed his daughter deserved every opportunity this marriage could offer, even if the nobility around them refused to see her worth. As Eleanor reached the entrance of the hall, the doors opened, and she found herself standing only a short distance from the man she was about to marry. Duke Edmund Ashworth stood tall in his formal attire, every inch the image of composed nobility. His face was unreadable, his stance rigid, prepared for what he expected to be nothing more than an obligation. He had told himself repeatedly that this woman meant nothing beyond the financial rescue she represented. He would remain polite during the ceremony and distant afterward. That had been his plan from the very beginning. But as Eleanor stepped closer and lifted her eyes to meet his, something shifted in the air between them. She did not look away. She did not lower her gaze in nervous submission the way he expected a woman marrying above her station might. Instead, she held his eyes steadily, with a quiet confidence that immediately unsettled him. There was no fear in her expression, no desperate need for his approval. She looked at him the way an equal would look at another equal, and for the briefest moment, Edmund forgot every rehearsed line of indifference he had prepared. He blinked, trying to regain his composure, but something about her gaze lingered in his mind. It was not simply her appearance, though she was undeniably striking in her own understated way. It was the way she carried herself, unwilling to be diminished by a room full of people expecting her to fail. The ceremony began shortly after, conducted in the hall's private chapel, with only close family and a handful of witnesses present. Edmund stood at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully neutral. Eleanor walked toward him with steady steps, her father giving her hand over with quiet pride. As the priest began speaking the opening words of the ceremony, Edmund found his attention drifting toward Eleanor again and again. Each time their eyes met, that same unexpected feeling stirred within him, a mixture of curiosity and something he could not yet name. When it came time for the vows, Eleanor spoke clearly, without hesitation, her voice calm and steady despite the weight of the moment. Edmund, usually so composed in public settings, found himself momentarily distracted by the sincerity in her tone. She was not performing for the audience. She meant every word she spoke, even if this marriage had been arranged rather than chosen. After the ceremony concluded, the guests moved into the main hall for a small reception. Whispers continued among the attendees, many of them expecting the Duke to maintain his usual cold distance, perhaps even publicly showing his displeasure with the match. Instead, something strange happened. Edmund remained unusually quiet, his eyes occasionally drifting toward his new wife, as she spoke politely with a group of guests near the far end of the room. His close friend, Henry Colton, approached him with a knowing smile. "You seem distracted, Edmund," Henry said, keeping his voice low enough that only the Duke could hear him. "I expected you to be counting the minutes until this event ended." Edmund straightened slightly, forcing his expression back into its usual composed state. "I am simply observing my new wife," he replied stiffly. "Nothing more." Henry raised an eyebrow but said nothing further, though the small smile on his face suggested he did not entirely believe his friend's explanation. Across the room, Eleanor stood speaking with an older woman who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on the recent changes in trade regulations. Unlike the many guests who had already dismissed her as unworthy of her new position, this woman appeared curious rather than judgmental. "You speak with great confidence about matters most young women rarely discuss," the older woman commented, studying Eleanor with interest. "My father always believed knowledge should never be limited by gender or status," Eleanor replied simply. "I was raised to understand the businesses that built our family's fortune, not simply to admire the results from a distance." The woman smiled thoughtfully. "That is a rare quality, especially in this house." As the evening continued, Edmund found himself unable to fully ignore his new wife's presence, despite his earlier determination to remain distant. Every time she spoke, every time she carried herself with that same quiet strength, his carefully built expectations of the marriage seemed to weaken just a little more. Near the end of the reception, as guests began departing, Edmund found himself standing near Eleanor for the first time without an audience directly surrounding them. The hall had grown quieter, and only a few servants remained nearby, clearing the last of the refreshments from the tables. "You handled today with more composure than I expected," Edmund said, his voice measured, careful not to reveal too much of the unexpected curiosity building within him. Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression calm but direct. "Did you expect me to crumble beneath the whispers, Your Grace?" Her boldness caught him off guard once again. Most people who spoke with him chose their words carefully, softened by fear of his position and reputation. Eleanor did not appear to share that same hesitation. "I expected many things," Edmund admitted honestly, surprising even himself with his candor, "none of which matched what I witnessed today." A faint, knowing smile touched Eleanor's lips, though she did not elaborate further. Instead, she simply nodded politely before excusing herself to speak with her father before his departure. Edmund remained standing in place, watching her walk away, his mind unusually unsettled. He had entered this marriage fully prepared to treat it as nothing more than a necessary arrangement, a transaction disguised in the traditions of nobility. Yet after only a single day, after only a handful of exchanged glances and brief conversations, he found himself questioning the very foundation of his expectations. As the last guests departed and the hall grew quiet, Edmund retreated to his private study, staring out the window into the darkening evening sky. He tried to convince himself that his reaction to Eleanor meant nothing significant, that it was simply the natural curiosity anyone might feel toward an unfamiliar spouse. But deep inside, a small, uncomfortable truth had already begun taking root. The marriage he expected to endure with distant tolerance had, in the span of a single day, become something far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. Elsewhere in the house, Eleanor stood by the window of her new chamber, watching the last of the carriages disappear down the long path leading away from the estate. She had entered this marriage prepared for coldness, prepared for a husband who viewed her as nothing more than a solution to his family's financial troubles. Yet something about the way Edmund had looked at her during the ceremony, that brief, unguarded moment before he composed himself again, had left an impression she could not easily dismiss. She did not know what the coming days would bring, whether the Duke's unexpected attention would fade back into indifference or grow into something neither of them had planned for. But as she settled into her new life within the walls of Ashworth Hall, one thing had already become clear to her. This marriage, built on necessity and judged by everyone who doubted it from the very beginning, was not going to unfold the way anyone expected. least of all the Duke himself. The following morning, the entire household seemed to move with a quiet uncertainty, as if everyone within Ashworth Hall was waiting to see how this unusual marriage would settle into its new rhythm. Servants exchanged curious glances whenever the Duke and his new wife happened to occupy the same room, and even the older staff members, who had witnessed countless family events over the years, admitted they had never seen the Duke behave quite so distracted. Edmund told himself repeatedly that his behavior meant nothing beyond simple curiosity. Yet as the days passed, he found himself seeking out reasons to be near Eleanor, whether through shared meals, brief discussions about the estate, or simply passing conversations in the hallway. Each interaction chipped away, however slightly, at the wall he had built around himself before their wedding day. Meanwhile, Eleanor began settling into her new surroundings with the same quiet determination she had shown from the very beginning. She spent her mornings exploring the estate's grounds, familiarizing herself with the property that had now become her home, and her afternoons reviewing the household's financial records, a habit she had carried over from her years helping manage her father's trade business. It did not take long for her to notice the estate's finances were far more troubled than anyone in the family openly admitted. Debts had piled up over several years, mismanaged investments had drained resources that should have secured the family's future, and several tenants had fallen behind on payments without any clear plan in place to address the shortfall. Rather than remaining silent about these discoveries, Eleanor approached Edmund directly one evening as he sat in his study reviewing correspondence. "Your estate's finances require immediate attention," she said plainly, taking a seat across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. Edmund looked up, momentarily startled by her directness. "I am aware of our financial situation," he replied, his tone carrying a hint of defensiveness. "It is precisely why this marriage was arranged." "Being aware and taking action are two very different matters," Eleanor countered evenly. "From what I have reviewed, several of your investments have been mismanaged for years, and no one has addressed the situation properly." Edmund studied her for a long moment, unsure whether to feel irritated by her boldness or intrigued by her willingness to speak so openly about matters most would consider inappropriate for a woman to discuss, let alone a new bride addressing her husband so directly. "You have reviewed my family's private records?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of surprise rather than anger. "I reviewed the household ledgers, as any responsible member of this family should," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "If you would prefer I remain ignorant of matters that affect my own home, you should have made that expectation clear before our marriage." Her response, though delivered calmly, carried an undeniable strength that left Edmund momentarily speechless. He had spent years surrounded by people who either flattered him excessively or avoided confrontation entirely. Eleanor did neither. She spoke with the confidence of someone who genuinely understood the matters at hand, and despite his initial defensiveness, Edmund found himself unable to dismiss her observations. "What would you suggest then?" he asked finally, leaning back in his chair with cautious curiosity. Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her face at his willingness to listen. Over the next hour, she outlined several practical suggestions, drawing from her years of experience within her father's trade business. She proposed renegotiating certain agreements with tenants, restructuring specific investments that had underperformed for years, and identifying areas where unnecessary expenses could be reduced without affecting the household's daily functions. Edmund listened carefully, offering occasional questions or points of clarification, and by the time their conversation concluded, he found himself viewing his new wife in an entirely different light. She was not simply the plain, unremarkable bride society had painted her to be before their wedding. She was intelligent, resourceful, and unafraid to challenge him when necessary. As the weeks passed, these late-evening discussions became a regular occurrence between them. What began as strictly practical conversations about the estate's finances slowly evolved into broader discussions about their personal thoughts, opinions, and experiences. Edmund found himself sharing stories about his childhood, his complicated relationship with his late father, and the pressures he had carried since inheriting his title at a young age. Eleanor, in turn, shared stories about growing up within a family that had built its fortune through hard work rather than inheritance, the judgment she had faced throughout her life for being seen as an outsider among the nobility, and her father's unwavering belief that knowledge and determination mattered more than blood status. Their conversations, though initially born from necessity, gradually transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. Edmund began looking forward to these evening discussions, finding himself disappointed on the rare occasions when Eleanor was too occupied with other matters to join him. One evening, during a particularly long conversation, Eleanor mentioned an upcoming social gathering hosted by one of the region's prominent families. an event many of Ashworth Hall's most judgmental guests would likely attend. "I imagine they will find plenty to whisper about," Eleanor said with a faint, knowing smile. "A merchant's daughter attending such an event will certainly give them something to discuss." Edmund studied her for a moment, noting the calm acceptance in her tone rather than any trace of anxiety. "Does their judgment not concern you?" he asked curiously. "I stopped allowing other people's opinions to define my worth a long time ago," Eleanor replied simply. "Their whispers say more about their own insecurities than they ever will about me." Her confidence, once again, left a lasting impression on Edmund. He found himself admiring her resilience, her refusal to be diminished by a society that had already decided she did not belong among them. On the evening of the gathering, Edmund found himself unexpectedly protective of his wife as they entered the crowded hall together. Whispers immediately began circulating among the guests, some questioning her presence, others openly speculating about the true nature of their arranged marriage. Rather than distancing himself from her, as many expected given his previous reputation for coldness, Edmund remained close by her side throughout the evening, engaging in conversations alongside her, and subtly redirecting attention away from any comments that bordered on disrespect. At one point, a particularly outspoken guest attempted to embarrass Eleanor by questioning her knowledge of certain noble customs, clearly expecting her to falter in front of the crowd. Instead, Eleanor responded with calm, articulate answers that left the guest visibly surprised, unable to find further fault in her composure. Edmund watched the exchange with quiet admiration, a small, unexpected sense of pride swelling within him. This was not the wife he had anticipated marrying only weeks earlier. This was a woman capable of handling herself in any situation, regardless of the obstacles placed before her. Later that evening, as they stood together near the edge of the crowded room, Edmund leaned slightly toward Eleanor, his voice low enough that only she could hear him. "You handled that exceptionally well," he said, a rare hint of genuine warmth coloring his tone. Eleanor glanced up at him, a small smile forming on her lips. "I have had considerable practice, Your Grace." Their eyes met for a brief moment, and once again, Edmund felt that same unsettling pull he had experienced on their wedding day, a feeling he had tried, unsuccessfully, to dismiss ever since. As the evening continued, their interactions grew increasingly comfortable, filled with quiet exchanges and occasional moments of shared laughter that surprised even those closest to them. Henry Colton, observing his friend's behavior from across the room, could not help but notice the significant shift in Edmund's demeanor since the wedding. "You seem different tonight," Henry commented later, as Edmund briefly stepped away from Eleanor's side to greet an old acquaintance. "Different how?" Edmund asked, though the faint smile tugging at his lips suggested he already understood his friend's meaning. "Lighter," Henry replied simply. "I have not seen you this at ease in years." Edmund did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting back toward Eleanor, as she continued speaking with a small group of guests near the refreshment table. He could not deny the truth in his friend's observation, even if he was not yet ready to fully acknowledge what it meant. By the time they returned home later that night, the atmosphere between them had shifted noticeably from the distant formality that had defined their earlier days together. As they walked through the quiet halls of Ashworth Hall, their conversation flowed easily, filled with genuine curiosity and mutual respect that neither of them had expected to develop so quickly. Yet despite these growing feelings, both Edmund and Eleanor remained cautious, unwilling to fully address the emotions building between them. Their marriage had begun as an arrangement built on necessity, and neither wanted to assume too much too soon, especially given the circumstances that had brought them together in the first place. Still, as they said their goodnights outside their respective chambers, lingering slightly longer than necessary before finally parting ways, it became increasingly clear to both of them that whatever this marriage was becoming, it was no longer simply an arrangement they were enduring out of obligation. It was something neither of them had planned for, yet something both of them were beginning, cautiously and quietly, to want. Over the following weeks, the bond between Edmund and Eleanor continued to deepen in ways that surprised everyone around them, including themselves. What had started as a marriage built purely on financial necessity had slowly transformed into a genuine partnership, filled with mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and an increasing sense of comfort in each other's presence. Eleanor's suggestions regarding the estate's finances began showing measurable results within just a few months. Tenants who had previously struggled to meet their payments found themselves working under fairer, more sustainable agreements. Investments that had been neglected for years were carefully restructured under Eleanor's guidance, slowly reversing the financial decline that had plagued the estate before her arrival. Edmund, who had spent years feeling overwhelmed by the weight of his family's financial troubles, found himself experiencing something he had not felt in a long time: genuine relief. For the first time since inheriting his title, he no longer felt as though he was carrying the burden entirely alone. Their working partnership soon extended beyond simple financial matters. Eleanor began accompanying Edmund on visits to various tenants across the estate, offering her own insights into their concerns, and often identifying practical solutions that Edmund himself had overlooked. The tenants, initially skeptical of the Duke's new wife given her background, gradually came to respect her genuine willingness to listen and understand their struggles. One afternoon, while visiting a family whose small farm had struggled following a difficult harvest season, Eleanor spent nearly an hour listening carefully to their concerns before offering several practical suggestions drawn from her own experiences managing similar challenges within her father's business ventures. Edmund watched quietly from a short distance, once again struck by his wife's genuine compassion and resourcefulness. This was not simply a performance meant to impress him or the surrounding community. Eleanor's concern for the estate's tenants appeared entirely authentic, rooted in a genuine desire to help rather than any expectation of recognition. As they rode back toward the main estate later that day, Edmund found himself unusually reflective, his thoughts occupied entirely by the woman riding quietly beside him. "You handled that situation remarkably well," he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Eleanor glanced over at him, a small, thoughtful smile forming on her lips. "I simply listened to what they needed, rather than assuming I already understood their situation. That is a skill many people in my position often lack," Edmund admitted honestly. "It is a skill anyone can develop, given enough patience and humility," Eleanor replied gently. Her words lingered in Edmund's mind long after their conversation ended. He had spent years surrounded by people who either flattered him excessively or avoided honest conversation entirely. Eleanor's directness, though occasionally uncomfortable, had gradually become something he genuinely valued, a rare source of honesty within a life otherwise filled with careful diplomacy and hidden agendas. As their bond continued to grow stronger, so too did the quiet tension neither of them had yet openly acknowledged. Their conversations, once strictly practical, increasingly ventured into more personal territory, filled with shared laughter, genuine curiosity, and occasional moments of comfortable silence that spoke volumes without requiring any words at all. One evening, following a particularly long day spent reviewing further improvements for the estate, Edmund and Eleanor found themselves sitting together near the fireplace in the main study, both physically and mentally exhausted from the day's efforts. "Do you ever regret this marriage?" Edmund asked suddenly, his voice quieter than usual, carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to express. Eleanor considered his question carefully before responding. "I regretted the circumstances that brought us together," she admitted honestly, "but I do not regret the marriage itself, not anymore." Her answer, though simple, carried a weight that settled deeply within Edmund's chest. He studied her closely, noting the sincerity reflected in her expression, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to consider the possibility that this marriage, born from necessity and doubted by everyone around them, might actually become something genuinely meaningful. "Nor do I," he admitted quietly, surprising even himself with the honesty of his response. Their eyes met, and once again, that same unspoken tension lingered between them, neither willing to fully acknowledge the growing feelings developing beneath the surface of their partnership. Yet despite their hesitation, it had become increasingly clear to both of them that whatever this marriage had become, it was far removed from the cold, distant arrangement everyone had originally expected. As the fire crackled softly beside them, filling the room with a warm, comfortable glow, Edmund found himself wondering, not for the first time, how a marriage he had entered with such reluctance had gradually become the one relationship in his life he genuinely looked forward to each day. But even as their bond continued strengthening, neither Edmund nor Eleanor could have anticipated the challenges that were quietly beginning to take shape beyond the walls of Ashworth Hall. Challenges that would soon test the very foundation of the trust they had worked so carefully to build. It began subtly at first, small comments exchanged among distant relatives, quiet questions raised during social gatherings, seemingly harmless observations that carried an unmistakable undertone of suspicion. Edmund's cousin, Gerald Ashworth, a man who had long harbored resentment over his own limited inheritance, had never fully accepted the marriage that secured Edmund's financial future, while leaving his own ambitions unfulfilled. Gerald had always believed himself more deserving of the Ashworth title and its accompanying privileges, and Edmund's sudden financial recovery through his marriage to Eleanor only deepened his existing resentment. Rather than confronting Edmund directly, Gerald began quietly spreading rumors throughout their social circles, carefully worded suggestions designed to plant seeds of doubt without directly accusing anyone of wrongdoing. He hinted that Eleanor's family fortune may not have been entirely honest in its origins, subtly suggesting that certain business dealings within the Hastings family carried questionable practices that had conveniently been overlooked given the financial benefits they offered the struggling Ashworth estate. At first, these whispers remained relatively contained, dismissed by most as nothing more than jealous gossip from a bitter relative. But as the rumors continued circulating, gradually reaching wider social circles, even those who had previously supported the marriage began expressing quiet concerns. Eleanor first became aware of the rumors during another social gathering, where she noticed several guests exchanging uncomfortable glances whenever her family was mentioned in conversation. Confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere, she eventually approached a trusted acquaintance, a woman who had shown her genuine kindness since her arrival at Ashworth Hall. "There are whispers circulating about your family's business dealings," the woman admitted reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable delivering such news. "I do not know the full details, but the rumors suggest certain practices that may not withstand close scrutiny." Eleanor felt a cold unease settle within her chest, though she maintained her composed exterior throughout the remainder of the evening. She knew her father's business dealings had always been conducted with integrity, built through years of hard work rather than any dishonest practices. Yet she also understood how easily rumors, regardless of their truth, could spread and cause irreparable damage once they took root within influential social circles. That evening, as she and Edmund returned home, Eleanor remained unusually quiet throughout the carriage ride, her thoughts occupied entirely by the troubling conversation she had overheard. "You seem distracted," Edmund observed, noticing her uncharacteristic silence. Eleanor hesitated before finally sharing what she had learned. "There are rumors circulating about my family, suggesting our fortune may have been built through questionable means." Edmund's expression shifted immediately, his earlier relaxed demeanor replaced by a controlled, careful neutrality that Eleanor had not seen since the earliest days of their marriage. "Do you know where these rumors originated?" he asked, his voice measured despite the tension building beneath the surface. "I do not know for certain," Eleanor admitted honestly, "but given the timing, I suspect they may be connected to someone unhappy with our marriage." Edmund remained silent for a long moment, his mind immediately turning toward his cousin Gerald, whose resentment over the family's inheritance had never fully subsided. Yet he hesitated to voice his suspicions aloud, unwilling to accuse a family member without concrete evidence. Over the following days, the rumors continued spreading, gradually growing more elaborate with each retelling. What began as vague suggestions of questionable business practices soon transformed into more specific, damaging accusations, claims that the Hastings family had knowingly deceived the Ashworth family regarding the true nature of their wealth, and that Eleanor herself may have married Edmund purely to secure a noble title, while concealing her family's true financial situation. Edmund found himself increasingly troubled by the escalating rumors, though his concern stemmed less from doubting Eleanor's honesty and more from frustration over his inability to immediately identify their source. Still, the constant repetition of these accusations, combined with his own long-standing tendency toward caution and skepticism, gradually began planting small seeds of uncertainty within his mind, seeds he desperately tried to suppress but could not entirely ignore. One evening, as tensions continued mounting, Edmund found himself unable to fully mask his growing unease during a private conversation with Eleanor. "Is there any truth to these rumors?" he asked, immediately regretting the question the moment it left his lips, especially given the flash of hurt that crossed Eleanor's expression. "You are asking me if my family built their fortune through dishonest means," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying a sharp edge of disbelief and hurt. "I am simply trying to understand the situation," Edmund replied quickly, though his attempt at reassurance did little to soften the tension building between them. "After everything we have built together these past months, you still doubt my honesty based on rumors spread by people who have never once given me a fair chance?" Eleanor's voice trembled slightly, though she quickly regained her composure, refusing to allow her hurt to fully surface. Edmund immediately recognized his mistake, the careless nature of his question, causing visible damage to the trust they had worked so hard to build. "Eleanor, I did not mean to imply. Perhaps you should take some time to consider exactly what you meant," Eleanor interrupted quietly, before turning and leaving the room, leaving Edmund standing alone, filled with regret over his momentary lapse in judgment. The following days passed in uncomfortable silence between them, their previously warm and comfortable interactions replaced by a cautious, guarded distance neither of them seemed capable of bridging. Eleanor, deeply hurt by Edmund's momentary doubt, began questioning whether the connection they had built together was truly as strong as she had believed, or whether societal pressures and rumors could easily unravel everything they had worked so hard to establish. Edmund, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated with himself, recognizing the damage his careless question had caused, yet uncertain how to properly repair the trust he had unintentionally shaken. He spent several sleepless nights reflecting on his behavior, gradually realizing that his momentary doubt had stemmed not from any genuine belief in Eleanor's dishonesty, but from years of ingrained caution and difficulty trusting others fully, a habit developed long before Eleanor had ever entered his life. Determined to uncover the truth behind the damaging rumors, Edmund began quietly investigating their origins, carefully questioning trusted associates, and reviewing correspondence that might reveal who had initiated such damaging claims. His investigation eventually led him back to his cousin Gerald, whose bitterness over his limited inheritance had apparently grown into a deliberate campaign to undermine Edmund's marriage and, by extension, his financial recovery. Confronting Gerald directly, Edmund demanded an explanation for the rumors that had caused significant damage to Eleanor's reputation and their marriage. "You have no right to interfere in matters that do not concern you," Edmund said sharply, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled anger. Gerald, initially attempting to deny any involvement, eventually admitted his role once faced with evidence Edmund had carefully gathered through his investigation. "You inherited everything, while I received nothing but empty promises," Gerald spat bitterly. "Your marriage secured your future while mine remains uncertain. Did you truly expect me to simply accept that without any resistance?" "Resentment does not justify spreading lies that damage innocent people," Edmund replied firmly. "Whatever grievances you hold against our family's inheritance, they do not give you the right to destroy my marriage through fabricated accusations." Gerald remained silent, clearly recognizing the seriousness of his actions now that he had been directly confronted. Edmund, though furious over his cousin's deceitful behavior, understood that addressing Gerald's actions was only the first step. He still needed to repair the damage these rumors had caused, both within their social circles and, more importantly, within his relationship with Eleanor. Returning home that evening, Edmund found Eleanor sitting quietly in her private chamber, her expression distant and guarded as he entered the room. "I discovered the source of the rumors," Edmund said gently, taking a cautious step closer. "It was Gerald, driven by his own resentment over our family's inheritance." Eleanor looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "That explains where the rumors originated," she said quietly, "but it does not erase the doubt you allowed yourself to feel toward me." Edmund immediately recognized the deeper hurt behind her words, understanding that resolving the source of the rumors alone would not be enough to fully repair the trust his momentary doubt had damaged. "You are right," he admitted honestly, taking a seat beside her. "I allowed old habits, years of learned caution and difficulty trusting others, to influence how I responded to you. That was unfair, and I deeply regret the pain it caused." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of insincerity, yet finding none. "Trust once shaken is not easily rebuilt," she said softly. "I understand that," Edmund replied, his voice filled with quiet determination, "but I am fully prepared to earn that trust back, for as long as it takes." Despite his sincere efforts, the tension between them did not immediately disappear. Eleanor remained cautious over the following days, her earlier openness replaced by a more guarded demeanor, as she carefully considered whether their relationship could truly withstand the pressures constantly surrounding them. Meanwhile, whispers continued circulating throughout their social circles, despite Gerald's role in originating the rumors. Even after Edmund publicly addressed the false claims, several skeptical members of society remained unconvinced, continuing to question Eleanor's place within the family despite the clear evidence proving her innocence. The strain of these ongoing pressures gradually became overwhelming for Eleanor, who began seriously considering whether remaining within a society so quick to judge and doubt her, despite everything she had accomplished, was truly worth the emotional toll it continued to demand. One evening, after another particularly tense social gathering filled with lingering suspicion and unwelcome questions, Eleanor returned home determined to make a difficult decision regarding her future within the marriage, a decision that would ultimately test everything she and Edmund had built together over the past several months. The evening air felt unusually heavy as Eleanor entered her private chamber, her mind racing through the events of the past several weeks. Despite Edmund's sincere efforts to repair the damage caused by his earlier doubt, and despite Gerald's rumors being thoroughly disproven, the lingering suspicion within their social circles had not fully faded. Eleanor found herself exhausted, not simply from the physical demands of managing the estate, but from the constant emotional burden of proving her worth to a society determined to see her fail. She sat quietly by the window, staring out into the darkened gardens below, her thoughts drifting toward the life she had left behind before this marriage had complicated everything she once understood about herself. She had built her identity around resilience, around refusing to allow other people's judgments to define her worth. Yet the past weeks had tested that resilience in ways she had not fully anticipated. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and moments later, Edmund entered the room, his expression carrying a mixture of concern and quiet determination. "I know things have been difficult," he began carefully, taking a seat across from her. "I understand if you no longer trust my judgment as fully as before." Eleanor remained silent for a long moment, carefully considering her response. "It is not simply about trust between us anymore," she admitted honestly. "It is about whether I truly belong within a world so determined to see me fail, regardless of how much I accomplish, or how genuine my intentions may be." Edmund's expression softened, recognizing the deeper exhaustion behind her words. "You belong here, Eleanor," he said firmly, "not because of the financial support your family provided, and not simply because of our marriage agreement, but because of everything you have personally accomplished since arriving at Ashworth Hall." Eleanor looked up at him, searching his expression carefully. "Do you truly believe that, or are you simply saying what you believe I need to hear?" "I believe it completely," Edmund replied without hesitation. "These past months have shown me exactly the kind of person you are: intelligent, resourceful, compassionate, and far stronger than anyone within our society could ever hope to be. I allowed a momentary lapse in judgment to threaten what we have built together, and I deeply regret that mistake. But my growing feelings toward you were never dependent on rumors or social approval. They developed because of who you genuinely are." His words, though sincere, did little to immediately ease the weight of uncertainty Eleanor still carried. She appreciated his honesty, yet she remained hesitant, uncertain whether their relationship could truly withstand the ongoing scrutiny surrounding them. "I need time," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "Time to determine whether I can continue living within a society that refuses to fully accept me, regardless of how our marriage evolves." Edmund nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her request despite the discomfort it caused him. "Take whatever time you need," he replied gently. "I will not pressure you into decisions you are not ready to make." Over the following days, Eleanor withdrew slightly from her usual responsibilities, spending considerable time reflecting on her situation, while continuing to fulfill her duties regarding the estate's management. Edmund, respecting her request for space, made a conscious effort to demonstrate his sincerity through consistent, genuine actions rather than empty words. He personally addressed the remaining rumors within their social circles, publicly defending Eleanor's honesty and reputation whenever necessary, ensuring that anyone who continued spreading baseless accusations understood the serious consequences of their actions. He also began openly acknowledging Eleanor's contributions to the estate's financial recovery, ensuring she received proper recognition for her efforts, rather than allowing others to dismiss her achievements. Slowly, through consistent effort and genuine accountability, the tension between them began gradually easing, though Eleanor remained cautious, unwilling to fully lower her guard until she felt completely certain of Edmund's commitment. One afternoon, while reviewing recent updates regarding the estate's tenant agreements, Eleanor discovered a troubling detail buried within Gerald's earlier correspondence, evidence suggesting his resentment extended beyond simple jealousy over inheritance. It appeared Gerald had also been quietly manipulating certain financial agreements behind the family's back, attempting to divert resources for his own personal gain under the guise of managing distant family investments. Recognizing the seriousness of this discovery, Eleanor immediately brought the information to Edmund's attention, setting aside their recent tension in favor of addressing this new, more significant threat to the estate's stability. "This goes far beyond simple gossip," Eleanor explained, presenting the documents she had carefully reviewed. "Gerald has been deliberately manipulating certain agreements for his own benefit, likely for quite some time." Edmund studied the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious as he recognized the full extent of his cousin's deception. "This explains far more than simply his resentment over the inheritance," he said grimly. "He has been actively working against our family's interests for his own personal gain." Together, they carefully compiled the necessary evidence, preparing to confront Gerald with undeniable proof of his deceptive actions. This shared effort, born out of necessity rather than romantic reconciliation, gradually helped rebuild a sense of partnership between them, reminding both Edmund and Eleanor of the genuine respect and trust they had built together, before external pressures had threatened to unravel everything. As they worked closely together over the following days, carefully building their case against Gerald's deceptive actions, the earlier tension between them slowly began transforming into renewed understanding. Eleanor found herself once again appreciating Edmund's willingness to take full accountability for his earlier mistakes, while Edmund continued demonstrating his genuine commitment through consistent, thoughtful actions rather than empty reassurances. Finally, after gathering sufficient evidence, Edmund called for a private family meeting, determined to address Gerald's deceptive actions once and for all, while also publicly reaffirming his complete trust and support for Eleanor in front of the very family members who had once doubted her. As the meeting date approached, both Edmund and Eleanor understood that the coming confrontation would not only resolve Gerald's deceptive actions, but would also serve as a definitive moment, one that would either solidify the trust and partnership they had worked so hard to rebuild, or reveal whether the damage caused by doubt and rumor had ultimately proven too significant to fully overcome. The private family meeting took place in the Grand Hall of Ashworth Hall, where portraits of past dukes lined the walls, silent witnesses to generations of family history. Gerald arrived, visibly nervous despite his attempts to maintain a confident exterior, clearly aware that Edmund's summons carried far greater significance than a simple social gathering. Several extended family members had also been invited, along with a few trusted associates who had previously questioned Eleanor's place within the family. Edmund had carefully planned this meeting, not simply to expose Gerald's deceptive actions, but to permanently silence the doubts that had plagued Eleanor since her arrival at Ashworth Hall. Standing at the front of the hall, with Eleanor by his side, Edmund began addressing the gathered family members with calm, deliberate authority. "I have called this meeting to address serious matters concerning our family's integrity," he began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the room. "Over the past several weeks, damaging rumors have circulated regarding my wife's family and their business practices. I have since discovered these rumors were entirely fabricated, deliberately spread by someone within our own family seeking personal gain." Gasps rippled through the room as Edmund presented the evidence he and Eleanor had carefully compiled, revealing Gerald's deliberate manipulation of family investments, alongside his role in spreading false accusations against Eleanor and her family. Gerald, faced with undeniable proof of his actions, attempted weak justifications, but the evidence spoke clearly for itself. The assembled family members, many of whom had previously entertained the rumors without fully questioning their validity, now understood the full extent of Gerald's deception. "Eleanor Hastings has done nothing but demonstrate remarkable integrity, intelligence, and genuine care for this family since the day she arrived," Edmund continued, turning to look directly at his wife, his expression filled with sincere admiration. "She has helped restore our estate's financial stability through her own knowledge and determination, and she has shown more genuine compassion toward our tenants than anyone within this family has demonstrated in years." Eleanor listened quietly, her expression carefully composed despite the emotion building within her chest, as Edmund continued his heartfelt defense. "I allowed myself, for one brief and regrettable moment, to doubt her honesty based on baseless rumors," Edmund admitted openly, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "That was a mistake I deeply regret, and one I have worked hard to correct. But let me be absolutely clear to everyone gathered here today, my trust and admiration for Eleanor has never wavered in its foundation. She is not simply my wife by arrangement. She has become someone I deeply respect, admire, and yes, someone I have come to love completely." The room fell silent, several family members exchanging surprised glances at Edmund's unusually open declaration. Eleanor turned to look at him, her composed exterior finally breaking as genuine emotion filled her expression. "Edmund," she began softly, though he gently reached for her hand, silencing her hesitation. "I should have said this the moment I first realized it," he continued, his voice softer now, meant only for her despite the gathered audience. "From the very moment you lifted your veil on our wedding day, something within me changed completely. I spent weeks trying to convince myself it meant nothing significant, that my reaction was simply curiosity rather than something deeper. But I was wrong. That single look left me completely speechless, and every moment since has only strengthened what I felt that day." Eleanor's eyes filled with unshed tears, though a genuine smile finally broke through her earlier guarded expression. "I felt it too," she admitted quietly, "though I spent considerable time convincing myself it could not possibly be real, given the circumstances that brought us together." "It became real regardless of how it began," Edmund replied gently, his hand still holding hers firmly. Turning back toward the gathered family members, Edmund addressed Gerald directly, his tone firm and unwavering. Given the evidence of your actions, both the deliberate manipulation of family investments and the deceptive rumors spread to damage my marriage, you will no longer hold any position of trust within this family's affairs. Any future involvement will require complete transparency and oversight, given the trust you have clearly broken. Gerald, recognizing the seriousness of his situation and the overwhelming evidence against him, offered no further resistance, quietly accepting the consequences of his actions, as the gathered family members watched in stunned silence. With Gerald's deception fully exposed and addressed, the atmosphere within the hall gradually shifted from tense uncertainty to quiet relief. Several family members who had previously doubted Eleanor approached her directly, offering sincere apologies for their earlier judgment, acknowledging the clear evidence of her genuine character and contributions to the family's well-being. As the gathering slowly dispersed, Edmund and Eleanor remained standing together near the center of the hall, finally alone amid the quiet aftermath of everything that had unfolded. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, looking up at him with genuine warmth reflected in her expression, "for defending me so openly and for finally being honest about your feelings." "I should have been honest from the very beginning," Edmund replied, gently reaching up to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. "I let old fears and years of learned caution prevent me from acknowledging what I felt for you almost immediately. I do not intend to make that mistake again." Eleanor smiled softly, her earlier hesitation completely replaced by genuine happiness. "Everyone expected you to reject me the moment I stepped out of that carriage," she said quietly, recalling the whispers that had surrounded their wedding day. "And instead," Edmund replied, a warm smile finally breaking through his usually composed expression, "one look left me completely speechless, and it has remained that way ever since." Their conversation was interrupted by the gentle sound of applause, as Henry Colton, who had remained quietly observing from the edge of the hall, stepped forward with a knowing smile. "It seems congratulations are finally in order," Henry said warmly, clearly pleased by the genuine happiness now reflected in his friend's expression. Over the following weeks, news of Edmund's heartfelt declaration and Gerald's exposed deception spread quickly throughout their social circles, effectively silencing the remaining doubts that had once surrounded their marriage. Those who had previously whispered judgment against Eleanor now found themselves genuinely impressed by her resilience, intelligence, and the clear devotion Edmund openly displayed toward her. The estate itself continued flourishing under their combined efforts, tenants prospering under fairer agreements, investments steadily recovering under Eleanor's careful guidance, and the overall reputation of Ashworth Hall gradually transforming from one of financial uncertainty into a respected symbol of resilience and genuine partnership. Eleanor's father, Charles Hastings, upon hearing of everything that had transpired, visited the estate personally, expressing his genuine pride in witnessing his daughter's strength and the clear devotion she had earned from her husband. "I always believed you deserved a life built on genuine respect rather than simple obligation," Charles told his daughter warmly during his visit. "It seems my hopes for you have finally been realized." Eleanor smiled warmly, glancing toward Edmund, who stood nearby engaged in a friendly conversation with several tenants who had once doubted his willingness to genuinely address their concerns. "It took some time to reach this point," she admitted, "but I believe we have finally built something genuinely meaningful together." As the months continued passing, Edmund and Eleanor's marriage, once doubted by nearly everyone within their social circles, gradually became widely admired as a genuine example of partnership built on mutual respect, resilience, and authentic affection, rather than simple social obligation. Their story, once whispered about with skepticism and doubt, eventually became a source of quiet inspiration among those who had witnessed its unexpected transformation, a powerful reminder that genuine connection often develops in the most unexpected circumstances, regardless of how a relationship may have originally begun. On a quiet evening several months later, as Edmund and Eleanor stood together on the balcony overlooking the now thriving estate grounds, watching the sun slowly set behind the distant hills, Edmund gently took Eleanor's hand, his expression filled with genuine contentment. "Everyone expected this marriage to fail before it even began," he said softly, echoing the doubts that had once surrounded their wedding day. Eleanor smiled warmly, leaning gently against him as they watched the peaceful scene before them. "And yet here we are," she replied quietly, proving every single one of them wrong. As the last light of the setting sun faded into the evening sky, Edmund and Eleanor remained standing together, united not simply by the arrangement that had once brought them together, but by a genuine bond built through resilience, honesty, and the quiet strength they had both discovered within each other along the way.